Well, good morning. I am Richard Simmons. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Executive Leadership, which is a men's ministry here in Birmingham, and also am the President of Renew Birmingham, which is a new ministry that we've started here in Birmingham to really work with the poor. And it's a real privilege for me to be here for a number of reasons. One, I'm a huge fan of Tim Keller. If you've ever heard me speak, I quote him incessantly. But I also was privileged for Collin to ask me to participate in this. And just a minute ago, he asked me, he says, do you by any chance have my bio? I said, well, no, I got the back of the book. So I'm going to read to you because he's very accomplished. I'm not sure how many of you know him. But Birmingham.
Too many.
Birmingham.
Too many in here.
We are privileged to have him to be here in our city, living here. He serves as Vice President for Content, Editor-in-Chief of the Gospel Coalition. He hosts the Gospel Bound podcast and has written and contributed to many books, most recently Rediscover Church, Why the Body of Christ is Essential, and the forthcoming Timothy Keller, which is what we're here for today. He has published with the New York Times and the Washington Post and has offered commentary for CNN, Fox News, NPR, BBC, ABC News, and PBS NewsHour. He edited Our Secular Age, 10 Years of Reading and Applying Charles Taylor and the New City Catechism Devotional, among other books. He's a member of Iron City Church in Birmingham. He's also an adjunct professor at Beeson Divinity School, where he also co-chairs the advisory board. And so we're going to just kind of have a little exchange. I'm going to basically ask questions. I've read the book. It's a great read. And you'll learn a lot, not only about Tim Keller, but just how he's conducted his life and how God has really done a major work in and through him. He truly will, if you've ever had a chance to ask him, clearly he recognizes that God has blessed the work. He is the one behind it. But my first question that I'd like to address is, Keller, I think most of you know, is such an iconic figure. And I'm just curious to know, how did you get this wonderful assignment to write this book?
Yeah. Well, thanks everybody for coming. It's just exciting to see everyone here, and thanks again to Little Professor for hosting us. I got to know Tim Keller in 2007. I was a news editor at Christianity Today magazine. My last assignment was to cover this new ministry, the Gospel Coalition. They were meeting for the first time in Chicago, and they had written something called A Theological Vision of Ministry, which I was not familiar with before, but I saw that message and I thought, my goodness, I could give my life to advancing this cause that was drafted by Tim Keller. And then I heard him give a talk there on gospel-centered ministry. Check it out on YouTube, it's amazing. This is where Tim probably most famously does his riff through the entire Old Testament in particular about how Jesus is the true and better Moses, Abraham, on and on all the way through that. So that... So I got to know him there, but I was writing a book at the time, Young, Restless, Reformed, and I said, hey, Tim, would you like to be interviewed for that? And he said, no. Fair enough. I persisted. I said, give me your email address. He did. And then I wrote him a bunch of questions, and he wrote back and said, yes, no, no, yes, no, no, no. Basically, he gave me nothing. He gave me a no thank you there. And then we started editing books together. That was a radical shift. There was a publisher that said, we want to publish a number of books about our changing culture and what we should do about it. And so we started working on those books together. That was right around when I went to seminary. And then I started working for him at the Gospel Coalition. This particular book came about in May of 2020. It clicked in my head. So, of course, we all remember what that was like back then. Well, just imagine being in New York City in March, April, May of 2020, of how difficult that was. Tim was pretty pessimistic about the kind of prospects for the church. And then he got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, for which we have no known cure. And in the process there, I was thinking, I've been trying to get somebody to write a biography of Tim Keller, and nobody seems to be taking that up. But I thought, well, somebody's got to write something. Somebody's got to do something before before he's gone. And we don't know how long that's going to be, but we don't have reason to think it'll be too long. And so actually the publishers, Honor Reflective, wrote him a note and said, we want to do this. Here's what we think would work. Tim will not talk about himself. He just doesn't do it. It would help somebody like me if he did. I've got a friend writing a biography of a well-known pastor, and he has journals from every single day of his life. When he was writing, I did not have, Tim doesn't, I don't even know if he does journal. But but with the proposal from the publisher was, we're not going to talk about you so much as talk about the people and events that influenced you. And that's exactly, if you're listening to Tim, he's always quoting other people. The way to get to know him is to read the footnotes of his books. He's that perpetual student. So we knew that that kind of approach would appeal to him. And then the message was, and if you want Collin to write it, he would be willing. But my point was, just somebody needed to do it.
Yeah.
Somebody needed to make that contribution, and I wanted them to have flexibility of that could be anybody to do that. But he asked me to do it. And the most important thing there is that, when you wonder, what does that mean? Well, when you're close with a figure that you're writing about, people are naturally going to think, well, this isn't very critical, right? And in some ways it's not. It's not intended to be that way. But the difference in this book is that I talked to his friends and to his family. They have not talked about any of this before, and that really required the Kellers to go to them and say, it's okay, you can talk to him. So that's kind of how all that project came together.
Cool. Well, based on what you just said, one of the things that struck me in reading the book is how well you have gotten to know this man over the years. And one of the most striking features about him seems to be his humility. Mm-hmm. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, so, interestingly, humility, it's a genuine thing for him where he's pointing, he's a pastor, so he's pointing people to Jesus. It's really embarrassing if we're pointing to ourselves instead of pointing to Jesus, especially in ministry. So that's the first thing. Second thing is he's, again, always pointing to other people. In fact, it's a little bit deceiving. He's not trying to be deceptive, but it can be misleading. He'll say, oh, I just got that from C.S. Lewis, or I just got that from, so-and-so, John Newton over here, Jonathan Edwards over here. Well, sure, you did, but you're the one who put this all together, and you kind of put a little spin on that. But the other thing is in the book, he's willing to talk about his weaknesses. And there's a well-known biography that came out last year of a figure who influenced him. And the message in that book was, you cannot talk about anything negative about that person. Well, I wasn't going to agree to that. And importantly, he would not have thought that was a wise thing to, because, of course, Richard, how do we learn as leaders if the people we're looking up to say, oh, well, of course I made all the right decisions and I knew exactly what to do in there. So that's an aspect of his humility. But the other aspect is that, this is on video, so I have to be careful here. Tim was never the cool kid at the table. He plays the trumpet. He was the drum major in the marching band. Kathy was the school newspaper editor. They're not cool. And they were not treated as such. They were not ever seen as most likely to succeed coming through seminary or anything. So a little bit of, you combine that with being in New York, and there's a sense, I opened the book by saying the first 10,000 people that Tim Keller sees when he walks out his door in Roosevelt Island in New York don't have any idea who he is. That might be true, but what's more true is that's what Kathy Keller told me about Tim. That's how they see themselves. Just not a big deal. It helps to be in New York. If you were in Birmingham or even in London, it would be a totally different deal. But so there's some sense in which they just don't see themselves as a big deal. It actually is a little bit, it's a little bit awkward sometimes, but it comes from a place of humility as well.
Yeah, I remember listening to one of his sermons on humility, and one of the things that he said about it, there is this duality in the humble. Yeah. He used the example of in the book of Revelation that Jesus is referred to as a lion, but also a lamb. Yeah. And I feel like that's what you see in Tim Keller. There is a boldness to him, but there's this humble, the word that's used in the Bible, meek side to him.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Tim went to Bucknell. He was a religion major. And it seems that in his first year or two, he, distaste is not the right, he just wasn't that fond of Christianity. He didn't like the aspect of an eternal judgment. He wasn't sure that Jesus was really still alive.
Yeah.
Obviously, that changed. When and how did that change?
So I think what will probably be maybe the most significant aspect of the book will be me talking about his mother. And that was the part, so if you talk to, that's how I went about the book. So if you talk to Tim about his mother, he'll say something like, well, she was my mother. Like, okay, I mean, what am I supposed to get out of that? But I talked to his sister. And his sister has thoughts about their mother. And when I learned about their mother, that I realized, the Prodigal God book about rediscovering or discovering grace, that's his autobiography, The Prodigal God from 2008. The fact is, his mother was an Italian Catholic who left the Catholic Church because it wasn't moralistic enough for her. Then went to the mainline Lutheran Church, and then she didn't like that they were active in the civil rights movement and social justice, so then she skipped to a kind of holiness tradition fundamentalist congregation in there. And that was difficult. Tim and his mom fought all the time, and they just did not get along. And so when he went to college, he basically had a crisis of faith. Keep in mind, this is 1968. So I was down at Lake Martin writing this chapter, I remember, and I played on Spotify channel for 1968 music. I just wanted to put myself in that place. Number one song when Tim went to college was Hey Jude. And it was the number one song there. But keep in mind that previous year, in April, you had King's assassination. Later that summer, you had RFK's assassination. You had the Democratic National Convention riots there in Chicago. That's all before he goes there. So there was a sense in which he was rejecting legalism, which was his mother. He was also rejecting liberalism because he didn't buy what his professors were teaching. It was the death of God movement, a lot of Freudian influence on religion. So he didn't like that as well. And he was really upset, especially about the church's moral witness, because he felt as though his church and his family had all lied to him about civil rights.
Interesting.
They had all taught him that was the source of evil, that King was the problem with everything. And he gets to college and he realizes, wait a minute, they all lied to me. So he walks away from the faith and doesn't practice, but he stays connected to InterVarsity. So he's out there, and the imagery I use, he's with his friend Bruce Henderson, and they're outside the hallway. They're in the hallway. And Tim's got these big gangly arms, and his friend thinks he's going to smash up the wall. He's going to bust a hole in the wall. He's so animated about all the questions he has about Christianity. But then in the course of that spring, he has just this dramatic experience where he kind of, as he describes it, comes to the end of his self. He's living a double life with the Christians over here, but a different lifestyle outside of that. And he finally it clicks for him, his conviction of sin, but also the overwhelming grace of God. And then the next thing we see, it's that friend's 21st birthday, and he wakes up and Tim Keller is lying on the floor at the foot of his bed, and his friend can just see that something's changed in him. Can just see a physical transformation, just spiritual transformation. And from then on, he was just gangbusters in terms of discipleship and learning and everything that we've seen from then.
That's good. Shifting gears a little bit, let's talk for a second about, there's a chapter in the book called The Woman Who Taught Him How to Study the Bible. She obviously did a good job. Would you just comment on that?
Yeah, Barbara Boyd, she's the first female staff member for InterVarsity. post-war period in there. She was discipled by C. Stacy Woods, who was the leader of InterVarsity in North America, who was discipled by Martin Lloyd-Jones, the famous pastor, World War II era, post-World War II pastor in London. So Barbara Boyd's perspective was pretty clear. She essentially popularized inductive Bible study method through InterVarsity. And so many of us have benefited. If you're picking up Jen Wilkins' books today, I mean, you're seeing a lot of that same heritage in there. And so Barbara Boyd's perspective was pretty simple. She used, we have kind of the formula of all the questions to ask the text in the book, but one of the things that she would do is she'd take the students and she'd say, you've got 5 minutes to look at this text of Scripture and observe everything you can see in there. And the students would be looking at it for about 3 minutes, and then they'd start twiddling their thumbs and say, I mean, okay, I get it. it's here. And she'd say, all right, now you're going to do that for 30 minutes. Be like, what in the world am I supposed to find in the text of Scripture for 30 minutes? And then all of a sudden, it's, all the connections start popping everywhere in there, and you realize the depths of Scripture. And that's what she did. And it was called a Bible and Life conferences that she would do. And at one point in the 1970s, they were, just all the rage on college campuses, which actually gives me an opportunity to mention, in case we ever think about being discouraged in our age, just think, I don't think there's anything we're going through now that quite compares to 1968 to 72. Right. The same time Tim Keller's coming to faith, or the Kent State shootings by the National Guard. There's student campuses across the country shut down in protest. Tim was out there with a placard evangelizing at the protests, all that sort of stuff. But just think about that. At that same time, campus ministries were exploding with spiritual interest and growth, and Tim and Kathy Keller were among those converts from that time.
Yeah, that makes me think of a very wise man I know who says, in the Scripture there are layers and layers of truth, and we usually just get to the top layers and don't get the depth that you're describing.
Absolutely.
In the book, as you can imagine, there's quite a bit in there about Tim's wife, Kathy. You feel like you really get to know this woman, and just quoting right out of the book, you said she was the most formative intellectual and spiritual influence in his life. Tell us about her.
Well, I'm grateful for some of you in the room who also know Kathy personally. You can attest to all of this. Kathy is she's a dynamo. So let me just give you a bit of context on Kathy. So Kathy Keller was one of the last people C.S. Lewis ever corresponded with. He died in November 1963, same day as the Kennedy assassination, the first one. So it's one reason a lot of people didn't notice. But so we've got a letter from C.S. Lewis. They sent several. We've got one of the letters in the book that Kathy shared with us. Got a picture of it in there. And so just think about that. Who has the gumption to write C.S. Lewis? And the crazy thing is, she didn't grow up in a fervent Christian home, typical mainline Presbyterian Pittsburgh home. And so she thought that Lewis was this struggling children's book author that at age 12 she was writing to encourage. Don't give up. I love your books. And seriously, she's complaining about her editor in the school newspaper. And Lewis is writing back saying, oh, editors are the worst. They're just like these childish conversations back and forth. It's just amazing. So, but not only that, but then after Lewis dies, she goes to his house. She flies as like a 14-year-old. She flies to his house. She meets with his brother. She hangs out. And then eventually she says to Lewis's wife's, of course, who died, Joy David, and her son, and says, yeah, it's a good thing I wasn't older. Because I would have given your mother a run for her money. So, that's just Kathy. And then there's an evangelist, a famous Episcopal evangelist named John Guest. He's still alive. John Guest came and did a Christian rock concert during the revival at Bucknell. That was a cool thing. But John Guest said, this Kathy Christie is the greatest youth organizer in Western Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh area. That's where he was active. So as a figure within Young Life and within, especially within Young Life in that area, she was pivotal. And So of course, and Tim relationally, their best friends are largely through Kathy. Kathy's been the relational glue that's kept these folks together from their seminary days. And so we could go on and on and on, but most of the theological conclusions that Tim would reach, Kathy reached them first. And she helped to introduce them to Tim.
Yeah. I told Collin there's a part from the book that I just got to read to you. It's about Kathy. And this was when they were trying to make the decision whether to go and plant the church in New York. And Tim insisted he wouldn't take the family there if she didn't approve. And when he told her that, it says Kathy erupted. She said, "You're not pushing this decision on me. You're the head of this household. If God calls you to New York, I'll wrestle it out with God." And so she did, over communion at New Life Church in Philadelphia. After all God had done for her, she realized, was it too much for him to ask her to raise a family in New York? "I guess we're going," she concluded. But this is really powerful. It says, Kathy considers the decision that Tim made to go one of the most truly manly things her husband ever did. The move scared him, but he felt God's call. He had no way of knowing the result would be a dynamic, growing megachurch. He just knew it was the next chapter of faith, even if the church were to end in failure. Very powerful. One of the great qualities, I feel like, of his teachings, and you hear this in his sermons, but you also read it in his books, is he loved to use literature. He loves to use literature outside of the Bible. For instance, he quotes Tolkien and Flannery O'Connor. Why was this so important to him? Or is it so important to him?
Part of this is his liberal arts education going all the way back to Bucknell. So Mako Fujimura, the visual artist, was an elder with Tim at Redeemer Presbyterian Church. And he did make this funny comment. He said, "We always knew when Tim had not prepared his sermon, because he would just quote C.S. Lewis a lot." And he said, "But it was great." Because Lewis is great. But so that was one thing that he noticed right off the bat, was like, wait a minute, this is all Bible. It's not just Bible, but like firmly evangelical. It's heaven, it's hell, it's judgment, it's grace, it's all that. But it's also Woody Allen movies. It's also Madonna's song lyrics. It's also Flannery O'Connor. That came from Richard Lovelace in seminary, 1972. His pneumodynamics, his spiritual dynamics class in there. So Tim's not the only person who said this, but he's one of the early ones of identifying that Flannery O'Connor's works are one of the best explications of sin that you're going to find anywhere and its effects. And so another thing that you'll see there with Tolkien is that you got to remember, and I actually had to cut part of this from the book because Kathy thought it was extraneous, but I'm publishing it elsewhere as an article. Got to work with what I can control. Tolkien was a countercultural figure at the time. He wasn't a mainstream, read them to your kids, show them the movies, kind of middle America figure. Yeah. I mean, we're talking little people who smoke things all day living in huts. I mean, this was very much seen in that sort of drug-induced 1960s, 1970s haze in there. So a lot of what we take for granted of the illusions, or I think about some of my favorite preachers, even just here in Birmingham, of how they weave in some of these other thoughts. Tim was doing that a long time before other people were doing that, and now we kind of just take that for granted. But I do think it's important for people to realize that only works if you also have a grounding in the scriptures. Amen. And also Tim spent most of the 1970s and 80s reading Puritan paperbacks. So you should probably make sure you're grounded in some of that literature, lest you kind of just go astray with some of the other stuff.
I just have to read this out of the book. I find it to be kind of funny. It says, when Keller quoted Shakespeare and The Village Voice, liberals thought he was one of them. Yeah. Then he'd confuse them with an explanation of the cross that would hearten any conservative evangelical. They had never heard a preacher rooted in the theology of John Owen, Martin Luther, Jonathan Edwards, and John Calvin, who also read the Village Voice alongside the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and First Things, the Nation, the Weekly Standard, Wired, and the New Yorker. So I think that just kind of tells you just the uniqueness of Tim.
And I don't recommend necessarily that reading diet for all people in ministry or even outside of ministry. Tim has unique giftings when it comes to reading and synthesizing things and remembering things. I do think it's interesting to bring this up to current. One of the former members, high-profile members of Redeemer, has recently come out this week and sharply criticized Tim, and she says the church is deceptive. I don't agree at all. I don't think the church is deceptive at all. It's just the phenomenon that I'm talking about there. She heard them talk about these things as if, oh no, those are liberal things. But that's the whole point of what Redeemer's been trying to do, is to say, no, there's not liberal and conservative. There's the Bible and there's the gospel. And some of it might sound a little bit liberal according to certain eyes when it's talking about justice or mercy. But it might sound conservative when it's talking about personal morality over here. So still that confusion exists a little bit today.
That's a good answer. Good answer. We'll ask a question or two more, and then I thought we might open it up for questions. When you read the book, one of the things you recognize is that Keller's life was greatly impacted by a number of the giants of the faith. One particularly that he writes a good bit about is Jonathan Edwards. Can you just maybe talk about Edwards, how he was so influential in Keller's life?
Yeah, Edwards, again, came through Richard Lovelace in there. So for those of you who teach in or have been to seminary, imagine you're taking your class on Jonathan Edwards and the professor invites you to his house and the house is covered in snakes. Like snakes everywhere in there. That was Richard Lovelace. He was quite a figure in there. I think I had to cut that part for the book too. So you're getting all the bonus content in here. But Edwards always, his thing was about bringing together the head, the heart, and the hands. So Edwards is engaging with cutting-edge Enlightenment thought at the time. He's at the top of that field. He's the intellectual pinnacle of colonial American life. Combines that, though, with the hands. He's got a strong emphasis on mercy. Of course, this is also why you should have 100 heroes, not one, because Edwards was grossly wrong on slavery and several other things, but especially on slavery. So that's, but he also had some really good stuff on the nature of true virtue. All of us have blind spots in there. But then also he's just talked about the inflamed heart, just a passion, a zeal for Christ. And that part, I think I called, Tim dubs himself in Center Church an ecclesial revivalist, a church revivalist. And I think that's the best description for him, and that's Edwards. It's somebody who's always pressing for a deeper, more intimate experience with God by the Holy Spirit, and especially through prayer. He's always been a revivalist in that sense, and that goes all the way back to the First Great Awakening tradition with Edwards.
Let me ask you one more question, and then maybe you can tell us a little bit about this new initiative. Yeah. But I found it interesting in the book you talk about George Whitefield, and you say that Keller would never have embraced the challenge of planting a church in New York City if not for Whitefield's influence. Can you maybe explain that influence?
Sure. Whitefield, another tremendous figure who was tremendously wrong about slavery, with another huge mistake there. But Whitefield's thing was, it's hard to put ourselves back in that setting. Whitefield was the first open-air preacher of our modern times. You have to go back, we see it in the Old Testament, in the Old Testament, yes, also with the prophets, but then the New Testament with the apostles. That was not common. The ordination, the churches, the state church, all that sort of stuff. So Whitefield's the first person there who breaks out of that. Now, there's been major biographies written of him. Tim loved Arnold Dallamore's biography of Whitefield. That's what he was reading when he was trying to get that evangelistic zeal and preaching like that. You got to remember, this is what Whitefield faced. When he would stand up to preach, and this is what we often forget about the good old days, they would throw dead cats at him. They would throw feces at him. They would throw rotten fruit and vegetables at him. He was, yes, the most powerful celebrity in colonial America. It was him and Benjamin Franklin, their contemporaries there. But at the same time, he was a tremendously unpopular figure as well, in part because he was denouncing other pastors. He was saying they're not real believers. Come out of those churches. But the whole point was Tim just is not, he doesn't have a naturally bold personality. He talks about a fear of man and a pretty extreme conflict aversion. He's not the stereotype of what you would expect of that bold evangelist. So it really was through prayer and the example of Whitefield to say, no, I can go to New York, and I can and I must be bold.
Sure.
And that's what was used from Whitefield.
Great. Tell us real quick about the Keller Center.
Yeah, you can grab
do you have these
Yeah, we got
available?
brochures back here. You can grab some koozies as well. We've got back there. So the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics. The book. I love talking about Tim and what we can learn from Tim. What I like even more, and what Tim would want, is to talk about what we can do to support the next generation, what we can do to raise up the next generation of believers. And I've got several of my students in here from my cultural apologetics class at Beeson. The idea is, how do we get the entire church to be thinking about the difficult transformations in our culture today? Let me just give you two. One is that 40 million Americans have left the church in the last 25 years. It's the largest, most dramatic, fastest religious transformation in American history. That's a problem. We're not really equipped together as a church to be able to respond to that. That's number one. Number two is that we are in a unique situation in the church. It's easy to be overdramatic about this, but the Bible's written in a pre-Christian milieu. It's pre-Christian times. Most of the churches operated in a Christendom context. Christianity is the dominant social, in the West I'm talking about here, dominant social political institution. We are the first generation in the United States in a post-Christendom environment, an environment where people think they know what Christianity teaches, they think that they hate it, and they think that they blame everything that's wrong in our culture for it, while they don't recognize that all of the reasons they're using to argue against it are from Christianity and don't make any sense apart from Christianity. So what we have to do is we need a joint effort between the marketplace, the academy, and the church to retrain parents, pastors, professors, to train and to raise up and to disciple the next generation in this context. So I'm not so much looking for, let's find the next Tim Keller, that'd be great if the Lord does that. We need an entire generation of parents, pastors, and professors who are thinking not the same things he thought, but are using the same ways to think deeply about what's happening in our culture for our generation. Tim told me last point here in December 2019, he said, I don't think you're going to be able to go back and just redo what I did. I don't think it's going to work. You're going to have to figure it out for yourselves. And he's doing it himself with a new catechism with his teenage granddaughter, things like that. And so the gospel doesn't change, the scriptures don't change, but our circumstances have changed, and we need to seek the Lord together prayerfully for the best ways to speak to those changes with that unchanging gospel. So that's what we're doing, thekellercenter.org. Grab a brochure and a koozie.
Right. Well, we have a few minutes to maybe take questions about either Keller or the book.
Hey, Richard, do you mind repeating the question for me?
Which
For
question?
the audio.
When the audience asks.
When the audio.
Okay, yes.
Chris, yeah, go for it.
You talk about Keller's development as rings on a tree.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that for us?
I'll just go ahead and I'll just repeat them. So the question is about Keller's The Rings on a Tree. So 2014, Tim did a video with Don Carson and John Piper for the Gospel Coalition, and he talked about influences. One of my colleagues sent that and reminded me about that, and I'm so glad that he did, because that is the organizing principle for the entire book. And I think it's applicable for all of us. I contrast it with lily pad theology. Lily pad theology is like when you jump from this fad to this fad to this fad to this fad. Rings on our tree are when you've got the gospel and the scriptures at the center, but you just keep growing. You just keep adding layers, dimensions, insights. And so lily pad theology would say, well, I was into George Whitefield over here, but now I'm into Charles Taylor's social criticism. That's really not helpful. What's helpful is when you've got your gospel core of being able to say, oh, now I can be reading broadly and understanding these other things, and they will help to round that out and to grow there. I've just found it to be a really helpful principle of intellectual and spiritual growth, of how we can both stay constant but never stop learning. It's been really powerful for me. Yeah, go for it.
Two caveats. I haven't read the book. I know it's no one rule for not to ask.
No, that's all good.
That this may be a moot question depending on the timing of the research.
Yeah.
I'm curious if the Kellers have a perspective on everything that's been going on the last couple. I
Yeah.
think about James Wood's article,
Yeah,
which was
right.
pivotal. I think that was 22.
Yeah.
And if there's any perspective.
Yeah, so the question is about, especially a lot of the criticism about Tim and a lot of the changes since 2020. Two answers there. It's a great question. Thank you for that. One of them is that I don't think for some reason people read Kathy Keller's article about the situation in 2020. Because what she plainly said in there was, I am concerned about churches that have stopped preaching the gospel that are getting into politics almost exclusively. And she could have been speaking about the left and the right there, but she was specifically speaking about the left in that particular situation. She talked in there about friends who have had to leave churches because they had gone completely astray from preaching the gospel, even within PCA circles. So I'm not sure why people didn't read that article, but it's out there. She published it. The second thing is that I don't think anybody who would be a staunch advocate of the most aggressive forms of whether it's critical race theory or whatnot that we've talked a lot about since 2020 could read Tim's extensive engagement with those as anything but critical of them. He's been very adamant about the gospel and its inconsistency with certain tenets of these new ideologies, but at the same time, he's been very clear about the Bible's teachings about justice. So that's been very clear for him. The most confusing thing for me is that when we launched the Keller Center, for some reason people thought that it was a response to the criticism of Tim, when in reality Tim has been talking about that stuff ever since he went to New York in 1989. It's not remotely new. If anybody in our culture understands what it is to preach the gospel in a negative or hostile culture, it's Tim from then. So he hasn't changed that, but anyway, so we'll see. There's a review of the book coming out from Kevin DeYoung in First Things, so we'll see how that looks. But it was intended to engage that conversation. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, so I was just, because Keller is such a big fan of Lewis, and I was thinking about Lewis, and he had like Warney, his brother, he had Tolkien, and eventually the Inklings, and so I'm just wondering for Keller, I think when I came of age theologically, it was in 2009, and what I saw initially was Piper, Clarkson, Keller.
Yeah.
I don't know whether or not that would be his version today, but
Yeah.
I'm wondering who would be.
So who's his kind of inner core there in terms of theological development? That's a great question. Haven't thought about that so in quite that way. Yes, you could definitely include them, but Tim's, I'll give you three groupings. One of them is his reading. I mean, those are his inklings, are the books. And so those are his conversation partners. That's number one. And then also, I mean, he's a pretty frequent correspondent. So the Keller Center Fellows that you can read about there, those are the people, James Eglinton and Alan Noble, and you can go all the way down the list. Those are the people that Sam Alberry, that he's been working with and dialoguing with. Through City to City, he's been working with global next generation leaders as well. But it's primarily the books, and then it's Kathy, and then it's his longtime friends. We're talking the college friends, well, not the college friends, the seminary friends and the Hopewell friends. Graham Howell, their best friend, Tim led him to the Lord in Hopewell. They would vacation together. He didn't tell me this in our interviews, and I am so frustrated that he didn't. So you guys get to hear it for the first time. Graham said, he said, I read the book, tears came to my eyes, remembering all the vacations that we took together in South Carolina with the Kellers. He said, I can't tell you how many books I read with Tim on the beach in South Carolina. And he said, Tim would pack suitcases of books to bring to the beach. I'm like, Graham, why did you leave that out? That should be in the book. Suitcases of books. So that's his idea. So they also say this, they'd go to England, and they'd be coming to some vista. They'd be with their best friends. And Tim would launch on an hour-long discourse on the history of the land that they had just seen on the vista in England. They're like, he literally stayed up all night, the night before, reading everything he could find about this location, prepare for it. But then they were like, I guess some people might think that's annoying, but Tim's a really good teacher. It was really interesting. Like we do tours of Charleston, be like, really? We're doing a history tour of Charleston on vacation? Be like, but it was pretty interesting. So that's Tim. Other question? Right back here. Yeah.
You've been kind in your discussion of Tim and his humility, and I
Yeah.
sense a little bit of that in you as well.
Oh, thank
Tell
you.
us some of the projects you have going on.
Yeah.
Is it a relief to get done with this and published? And
Is it a relief to get done with this, and what's next?
tell us more about yourself.
Yeah. Well, I've felt as though I have two kind of callings that clarified as a part of this project. One of them was to leave behind a different and better local church in Birmingham, Alabama. Not because we have some sort of bad church in Birmingham, Alabama, but we have a particular historical legacy in Birmingham, Alabama, and I would love for my children, our children, and our grandchildren not to be burdened by that negative legacy in the same ways. So I'd like to see a transformation. I believe that if revival comes to Birmingham, it'll be churches that are mixing across the divides that typically separate us in our city so visibly. That could be class, that could be race, it could be any number of things. So that's one calling, and hopefully, trying to do that through our own local church and through our own family and through friends in other churches as well. The second is to help prepare the next generation for this transformation that we're seeing. So thankfully I get to do that at Basin Divinity School. It's a wonderful opportunity. Doug Sweeney is an absolutely amazing leader there as dean. And at Basin we have an opportunity for it's a global platform of people being trained from around the world, around the country, who are coming here to get a top-notch education. In fact, one of the things that I think about in here, Tim Keller's experience, I think about, Court over here, his parents went to Gordon Conwell about 5 years right after Tim and Kathy. Tim's experience at Gordon Conwell was because of the great teachers, but it was because of the residential education. It was because they lived together, they learned together, they had meals together, they got to know each other. And the only place that's really doing that in the same way today is Beeson. And so I'm really grateful for that. And so just trying to work through the Keller Center and through Beeson to try to help equip that next generation to be prepared for those transformations, just like we've seen from Tim and other good examples, to be bold, to be orthodox but modern, to be bold but to be humble at the same time, to be ecumenical but to be convicted. I'm blessed that Doug Sweeney was one of my mentors at Trinity when I was there. Timothy George was one of my mentors. I was a college student calling Timothy George, asking him for help on projects that I was doing, and he would always meet with me. So these are the folks who were examples for me. And so those are kind of the main two things I'm working on. I'm preaching a couple times at Advent coming up for the Lenten series, and I'm working through currently an apologetic on Elie Wiesel's Night and the Holocaust, and the problem of the silence of God amid evil, and the transformation in the moral revolution in Western culture from Jesus as the icon of morally exemplary behavior, the cross, and I won't get into this too much, but you'll see why it's provocative. World War II and the Holocaust shifted us away from a focus on the cross and on Jesus as the example to live up to instead now we have Hitler and the swastika as the negative to just avoid. Alec Ryrie talks about this in the book Unbelievers. So that is a moral revolution that's completely transformed the way we think. So before it's like, do you live up to Jesus? No, you're a sinner, you need grace. Now it's, at least I'm not as bad as Hitler. That's a complete transformation. So that's what I'm trying to work through. We'll see if I can cram that into 20 minutes at Advent. Good luck.
All right, one more question. One more question.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, Ben.
One thing about Keller's writing, he seemed to do that at the tail end of his...
Yeah, 56 years old.
Was that by design?
58.
Do you feel like he didn't
Yeah.
have to go write a book. He waited until he was 50, in his 50s.
Great question, Ben.
Right.
Two explanations for that. I'll be succinct on that one. So most of his ministry, there was not the internet. So his levels of popularity and opportunity probably would have been significantly expanded if he'd been a different generation. Even if he'd just been a half generation behind, he would have been planting a church in the late 1990s, not the late 1980s. That would have been a totally different situation with the internet. So perhaps he would have been more well-known, he would have published, something like that. That's a possibility. The second thing is that New York affords you certain opportunities you don't get elsewhere. For example, publishing with Penguin Random House. That was in part a connection in New York through that publisher, and then they invited him to be able to work with them, and he's worked with them almost exclusively since then. So that just kind of developed later. The next thing is that Tim was again, you can see here, he's not remotely perfect, doesn't claim to be. He was a 90 to 100 hour a week person. Okay, I mean, this was very hard on him, it was hard on his family. I'm just not sure where he was going to find that margin for writing. So I don't think it's a coincidence that you don't see him writing books until 2008, which is after the second staff crisis. So the first staff crisis he had, they brought in Dick Kaufman as the executive pastor. The second staff crisis, they brought in Bruce Terrell as the executive pastor. It's only after Bruce got there that Tim started writing books, and I don't think that's a coincidence. Also after Kathy's Crohn's disease, I mean, it's still an issue, but that was a major problem in the early 2000s, and Tim's thyroid cancer. Yes, thyroid cancer back then. So all those reasons are why. But it's funny, he's got 1,500 sermons from Hopewell, Virginia, and I did not get access to them. And I wonder if Tim will conveniently somehow never publish them. Because, so like, I mean, just your early stuff is not your good stuff, usually. So,
Just one more follow-up.
yeah, go for Victor.
Only for you, Victor.
Yeah, only for you, Victor.
I was just saying,
Yeah.
I remember on one of your interviews, Collin, you said you were asked what would Tim Keller be remembered most for?
Oh, yeah.
And you said his book.
Yeah, what will he be remembered most for? Yeah, so when you think about the church will still be there. Praise be to God, the Gospel Coalition, Redeemer City to City institutions will still be there. It's interesting, think about Billy Graham. Younger generations, I bet if I asked my undergraduates, they don't even remember Billy Graham. We're talking like the biggest celebrity in America for a long period of time, most famous evangelist in American history, Western history most likely, almost forgotten. The difference with Billy Graham is that number one, his sermons are good, but like the power of Billy Graham was the unction that the Holy Spirit gave. There's nothing really special necessarily about that. And then Billy did not, well, first of all, he didn't really write his own books, but second, they're just not that good. So the difference with Tim is that his sermons have a little bit more depth and staying power to them, so I think those will be listened to for a long time, but it's really going to be the books. They are very situational. He always writes to a specific place and time, but I think hey, I hope maybe somebody in this room can write a better book than Meaning of Marriage. I hope they can. I hope they will. But for now, that's still the best book out there. Yeah. And you could take marriage, you could take prayer, you could take suffering, you could take the idea of idolatry to grace to make apologetics. It's still the good stuff out there, and that'll last for at least a generation, I would assume, maybe longer in some cases. But like, nobody reads everything. Well, Tim does. Nobody else reads everything that Lewis wrote, but we all still read some of it. And I think that's probably going to be the case.
Great interview.
Thanks.
Outstanding.
Thanks, Richard.